We all know the importance of how we represent ourselves. The things we say and the things we do influence the people around us. It's all about the message we are sending, including the things that we wear. Christians can be more aware of the messages we bring to others in their clothing with Covenant Press. Covenant Press is a faith-based Christian apparel and accessory store that is fearfully and wonderfully made. If you want to wear the message of Christ and Christianity, then go to their website at covenant-press.com. That's www.covenant-press.com. For the next 24 hours, you will get 25% off the purchase of $50 or more using the discount code GROWTH at checkout. Sign up and become a member to receive points for future purchases. Again, that's covenant-press.com, www.covenant-press.com to get 25% off your purchase of $50 or more using discount code GROWTH at checkout. Tell your friends and family about covenant-press.com so we can all share the message. Welcome to Laquita's Toolbox, where we deliver relevant content in the form of tools that empower entrepreneurs to elevate personally and professionally. Good is only good until greater is envisioned. You know there's another level in you. Here we discuss the tools to get you there. Lean in as Laquita and her guests present you with strategies and insight for unlocking your full potential to realize your boldest dream.
Welcome back to another amazing episode of Laquita's Toolbox. I am your host, Laquita Monley, and I am absolutely excited about today's episode for a number of different reasons. But let's just start with the first reason. Number one, because I've never had this particular topic of discussion on the show today. So I always like number one, celebrating number one. So you guys just take a minute and celebrate that with me, if you will. And while we're celebrating this number one on today, get something to write with and something to write on, because those of you that follow the show know that it is absolutely imperative that pen and paper do not forget, and you don't want to miss any of these tools that my guest is going to share with us today. You know, in the studio, I have Miss Bron Williams. She is the bias specialist, and that is a hot button topic today that we're discussing, especially in the realms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Miss Williams is going to be, she is the very first guest that I've had on the show to speak about this topic. So hit those like, share, subscribe buttons on your favorite podcast listening platform. If you're a returning guest, thank you so much. If this is your first time, go ahead and hit that follow button on your favorite podcast listening platform so that you won't miss any episodes as they come out on a weekly basis. But without further ado, Bron, how are you today? And thank you so much for your patience and for being a guest on the show today.
It's so lovely to be here, Laquita. Great to talk with you across the globe.
Yes. Love technology, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
So please tell the guest where you're from and let them just marvel in technology for a minute, because you're in my tomorrow and I'm in my today.
Absolutely, yes. We talked about that earlier. I'm in Melbourne, Australia. And a little heads up, it's Melbourne, not Melbourne.
So let me get my American English right. Melbourne.
Boom. Yeah, Melbourne.
For my American English, at least not in this episode. I'm gonna try though. I will try.
Yeah, one of the things us Aussies is known for is shortening things and sort of swallowing our vowels. So even though it's spelt Melbourne, we say Melbourne. So we sort of swallow about
Melbourne.
three letters there in our name. So, yeah, Melbourne, Australia. So sort of down there on the bottom of mainland Australia, born and raised here, so through and through Aussie. And, I do love being able to talk across the globe. And even though your listeners can't see me, because they can't, I'm a grey-haired person. So I am in what I lovingly call the last third of my life. And I have a favourite phrase that says, you can teach an old dog new tricks. Because I tell you, I have learned so much in the last 5 years about technology, using a variety of platforms, being able to talk across the globe like this, in person, in real time, even though you're in my yesterday, was the thing of science fantasy when I was a child, and now I'm living it, and I just think that's wonderful.
It is amazing, isn't it? The connectivity that we have because of not just the World Wide Web, but all of these amazing individuals who created these amazing apps and software that kind of bring us together as a global community. It's pretty awesome. And it really speaks to the necessity of our topic today and why diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that is such a big push, because we are a global community. And because we are a global community, we have to come to a place where we realize different is different, but different is not wrong.
Very much so. One of the things that I have learned in the last few years, as I've had to look at my own unconscious biases, because there's no point in me talking about this from a purely academic point of view. It has to come from my own lived experience and ongoing lived experience, is that somewhere along the line I realised that I had learnt that difference was a threat. I grew up in a very monocultural part of Sydney, Australia. So, very white, conservative, Bible Belt area of Sydney, and everybody looked like me, sounded like me, thought like me. And then I had an opportunity to do something right outside of my comfort zone, and that's when all of these unconscious biases started to make themselves felt. And I realised that even though I hadn't deliberately or intentionally, I think, been taught that difference was the threat, somewhere along the line I'd learned that. And what I've been able to do now that I realise that is to flip that on its head and see that difference is an asset, which opens up a whole new world and possibilities.
I love the way that you say that. Difference is not a threat, but difference can be an asset. And it is an asset. Today, I'm in Texas, and it's the southern part of the United States, and it's right in the middle of our Bible Belt.
Yes.
Yes. And so as an African-American woman and a believer, I've had the opportunity, and as a military spouse, let me put those together real quick. I've had the opportunity, because of my husband's career, to live in different places around the world. America, UK, and Germany, and just travel Africa and some other places, right? And through some hard-learned lessons, I had to learn that different is different, not wrong. And as you said, different can also, in most instances, be an asset, because different gives me a totally different perspective, a totally different worldview from my own little sheltered worldview.
Yes.
We were having a conversation then, my husband and I were having a conversation in our favorite little mom and pop spot. And on Tuesdays, they have a Bible study that goes on in there every Tuesday. And someone posed the question as to why something like Black Lives Matter was necessary, but viewed as evil within our faith. And I won't get into the details of that conversation. I'll probably save that for a live, because it's real juicy and I want to see the comments. But this conversation was happening, and it was, I will say, I'll borrow your terminology. It was some Caucasian men and women that were living in the last third of their life, right? And their point of view was being challenged by some of the members in their group who were a minority, whether Hispanic and African American and Native Hawaiian. And that question was going on. And I think it's a really good place for us to start, because you, as you mentioned, with you being from the Bible Belt in your area, within our faith system, sometimes we're so locked in to that linear way of thinking that we harm ourselves more than we help ourselves in terms of reaching out to other people. So why is it so important that we acknowledge and address these biases, whether you're a believer or not? But I just thought that, today's conversation we had at our favorite coffee shop really worked very well into what I knew you and I would be talking about today.
Yeah. Look, you're so right. Bias shows no favourites. It's a human condition. It's part of how every human being thinks. I have my eldest granddaughter has just turned 18. My youngest granddaughter is 5. So my 5-year-old granddaughter already has biases. She doesn't recognise it yet, but she does. And it doesn't matter whether your skin is white, black, or any shade in between.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether you, like me, you're a baby boomer or you're a millennial or a Gen whatever letter. It doesn't matter whether you grew up in the USA, Australia, in Nepal, in the far north Russia, in Finland, wherever, a tiny Pacific island. We all have biases. It's part of being a human being. And a lot of them, or all our biases are formed early in life, and they come from things like, the input from our families, because families like to tell us, what's right, what's wrong, what's healthy. But they also tell us, that person's a good person to mix with, but, no, you shouldn't mix with those sorts of people. This is the right job for you. Oh, no, that job's not worthy of you. So we get all these messages from our family. We get them from our culture. And certainly I see Christianity is, in a sense, a subculture within the broader different cultures in the world. And I certainly, growing up in that, I had a lot of messages around, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a white woman, all of so many different things. But then the media plays a huge part. Even, our friendship groups at school and, the sporting clubs we belong to, there's all of these externals that either overtly or covertly send us messages and then reform biases, which are just ways of categorizing people and ideas. But one of the unfortunate side effects or consequences of bias is that often most of the time, we privilege our own way. It's my way or the highway. Of course, I've got it right, and for me, I'm university educated. I've got it, I live in a developed country. Certainly, I would know better than someone who grew up on a little island in the Pacific. It's those sorts of unconscious things that elevate ourselves in our own position and thinking, but we also denigrate others. And that's where bias can start to become a real difficulty in relationships, but also in our decision making. Because when it comes to decisions, we often don't examine all of the options available to us. We just pick maybe the first or the second one, because our viewpoint is limited by our thinking.
Yes. Oh, now see, there's so many things we can unpack right there. So many things. I believe that the fact that a large majority of our biases are unconscious is the reason that it's so hard for people. And then we'll talk about organizations along the way as well. But let's focus on the individual, because we make up the organizations. It's so hard for us to unpack it and deal with it because it's woven into the very fabric of who we are. And so now you're challenging me to change. You're challenging me to be different. You're challenging me and making me feel like you're saying I'm wrong. And the way that I've been taught is wrong. And when, in some instances, fair enough, it could be wrong. But in most instances, it is, maybe you're not wrong, but you're not right either. Because the way that you feel and think as an individual from X background and the way that someone as an individual from Y background, you may have differences of opinions, but it's right for the individuals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and look, I like the fact that you've used these words right and wrong, because so often we attach moral values to our biases.
Yes.
And one of my goals is to actually to normalise the conversation around bias and to remove any sense of judgment and guilt and shame around it, because bias is a human condition. It's part of the human condition. It's part of how we all think. So we often think of bias as we are judged for having biases. Somebody has pointed the finger at us and said, you're wrong, you're biased, and therefore you're bad. Now, I don't believe that bias has any moral value. Bias is not an emotion, but I say this about emotions too. Emotions don't have any moral value. There's no ethics necessarily around our unconscious ways of thinking. It's what we do with those biases, the words that come out of our mouth, the actions that we do, and then, thinking about institutions and organisations, the structures that we put in place or that we perpetuate or we allow to be perpetuated. That's where we can go, this is not helpful. And I suppose even then I would prefer not to use words like bad or good or right and wrong, because that's such opposite ends of the pendulum swing. Because most of us, I'm a white woman. I have white privilege. I just got that because that's how I was born. However, that's the reality, is that I have a set of privileges purely because of the colour of my skin. And I'm not, I'd be very honest here, I'm not sure how I as an individual dismantle white privilege, but I can't as a, a system. What I can do at my own level, which is all most of us can do, is to own what the issue is. And for me, I have white privilege. And then to be aware of either how can I use that to invite other people in who don't have the privilege that I have naturally because of the colour of my skin, or how can I change the things that I can because of whatever position I might hold. So it's about looking at allowing our biases to inform our actions and because they do inform our actions, but doing that on a conscious or intentional level rather than in an unthinking.
And now, see, that's some more things that we can unpack. And you must have been listening to our conversation today. You had to have been listening to our conversation today. Guys, if this was a video, you would see me. I am so excited. The smile on my face is beaming sunshine because this is so good to me. But let's take just one moment here, if we could, in the conversation, and take one pause and let me thank our sponsors. I'd like to take this one moment and thank the sponsors of Laquita's Toolbox podcast, and that is Covenant Press. Covenant Press is a faith-based Christian apparel and accessory shop where individuals can go to that website and order Christian apparel and accessories that allow you to wear the message of the love of Jesus Christ. Go out to www.covenant-press.com and take a look at the amazing things that they have to offer there, and make sure that you are paying attention to the pop-ups, because they always have some amazing specials, and you want to make sure you grab those codes so when you get to the checkout that you're able to apply the relevant discounts and receive a discount as when you're shopping there with Covenant Press. So thank you so much to Covenant Press for your support of all things Laquita Toolbox. Jumping back into our conversation, take a minute, if you could, and unpack the definition of bias, because you said something really good there in our last segment. It's not right. It's not wrong. It's not moral or moral degradation, but bias is a way of thinking that we've developed over time. Could you please, let's just take a minute for those that may not know. It's okay, Laquita, y'all talking about something. It sounds interesting, but what do you mean by bias? Perhaps we challenge their definition of what bias is. So if you could give us a definition of what bias is.
Yeah, good. Thank you for asking that, because it's very easy to assume that people know what I'm talking about. Look, unconscious bias is, and I'll say what I've said before, it's simply part of the way that we think. It's one of the things that we do. Now, it what an unconscious bias is, it's a way of thinking that generally privileges one way of thinking or idea or group of people over and above another group of people or a set of ideas, and often to the detriment of that second group. And, these biases, these ways of thinking get set in our thinking when we're young, before we have any cognitive ability to assess whether the messages that we've been receiving are actually helpful or not. Mm-hmm. So very much in our growing up years as a child, even into our early teens. And the messages largely come from our families. And then again, this is not done with any sense of harm or harmful intent generally. Mm-hmm. We do know that there are families that teach, quite intentionally teach racism. Mm-hmm. We know, but on the whole, people don't do that. It's the little, I'll give you a funny example. Now, okay. I grew up in a strongly Protestant family. And my sister and I both wanted to get our ears pierced when we were in our teen years, as so many teenage girls want to. Mm. My mother would not let us get our ears pierced because only Catholic girls get their ears pierced. Now, that was, for my mum, that's her definite bias, was this Catholic Protestant divide. If you were Protestant, she didn't mix with Catholics. Us Protestants, we had the right grasp on faith. And it went right down through to, I couldn't get my ears pierced. So that's a bias there. Mm. Now, my mum wasn't trying to be rude or nasty to Catholics. Like, she was a generally pleasant, well-liked, lovely human being. For me, that idea made absolutely no sense. I had Catholic friends at school, and I couldn't see the connection between pierced ears and things like that. But see, that's a little bias.
Yes.
And it's just a passing comment. Mm-hmm. I didn't even realise how much of a bias that was until, 40 years later, 50 years later. And I'm starting to look into this area and I go, oh, gosh, that's such an obvious thing. So it's these sorts of little comments mm-hmm. about what we believe is right and wrong. And I'm not talking about the big things like murder's wrong, mm-hmm. murder's across the globe, but it's these other little things that we attach a moral value to or some sort of sense of importance that, in a sense, my mum was communicating that us as Protestants were better, or we were right, and mm-hmm. the Catholics were not. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we were not allowed to have anything, even as simple as pierced ears, that would make people assume that we were Catholics, because that would be a no-no. So, it's those little things that in the big scheme of things are not important, but they do influence our interactions. Mm. And as I said, when it comes to our decision-making, if we've got these little unconscious ways of thinking mm-hmm. that we don't examine, then we do have some real problems with our decision-making, because what we do is we're limited by to a certain set of choices.
Yes. I love the fact that you use that example, because it really leads into the next discussion, because oftentimes we look at bias and more so mix it with racism.
Yes.
Or sexism.
Yes.
And it's actually something that can happen within that particular group, like within your group of Caucasian Christians, there was still a bias between the different groups of Christians, but everyone's skin color is the same. You know, everyone's skin color is the same and everybody's worshiping the same Jesus, but the biases were there in place unconsciously. And that I really like that you put that out, because it helps people to understand that biases happen, and it has, in a lot of instances, it has absolutely nothing to do with the color of your skin.
Yeah. Look, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, all the things that we see and rail against, we want to change, they are outworkings of bias. But bias is much broader and in many ways much deeper. I've often likened bias, I've got two metaphors. One is, and so either of them might be helpful for your listeners. The first one is as an iceberg. So, like we know about icebergs, 10% above the waterline, 90% underneath. So we see things like racism.
Mm-hmm.
We see things about, sexism and gender inequity, discrimination around disability, ageism. We see all these different things, even things like bullying, harassment. We see all of these things on the top. But underneath, the thing that is, in a sense, fueling these behaviours and attitudes are our unconscious biases that we haven't actually looked at. So that's one way of looking at bias, which might be helpful for your listeners. Another way is, in a sense, you flip that. Bias is a bit like a puppet master, with the strings attached to a person. And, each of the strings is lifting the hands and the legs and the arms and the shoulders. And, each of those are things like racism, sexism. And, when we move unconsciously to the pull of the puppet master, because one of the things, for me, one of the most helpful ways of looking at this was put together by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he talks about two ways of thinking. One, which is fast thinking, which is like bias, where you make snap judgments, things that you haven't really, you see someone coming towards you in the street and you make an automatic assumption about who they are and what they might do to you. That's fast thinking. And then there's slow thinking. That's when you, even in the same situation, and I'll give a personal example here. As a white woman, if I see a group of dark-skinned young men walking towards me, I have a fast thinking going, a bit of shock of, I have to be on my guard here. Now, do I know these men? No. Are they going to do anything to me? Probably not. The chances are probably less than 1%. But they're different to me. They're young, they're muscly, and instinctively I respond with a bit of fear. So what I have to do then is to go into the slow thinking mood and go, yes, I've registered this fast thinking, but no, I'm not going to act on it. No, I'm not going to abuse these young men or walk to the other side of the road. I'm aware that my instinctive reaction, because these men are different to me, is to go, oh, no. But my slow thinking kicks in and I go, oh, well, actually, they're probably just young guys out of school. They're going down to McDonald's. And, it's those sorts of things. It's about not allowing the strings of the puppet master to keep pulling us and making us do the things that we, in a sense, our values wouldn't normally allow us to do.
That's a really good example. And I love how you use the iceberg example as well as the slow and the thinking and the fast thinking. And the puppet master, that our biases are actually the root cause of the symptoms of all of the isms, racism, classism, ageism, all of those things, which is why it can be so hard for people to change.
Yes.
Because to address that 90% of that iceberg that's underneath, it requires a lot of work. It's not a quick thing. And it challenges the thinking. It challenges the perceptions that have been taught literally to an individual from generation to generation to generation. But when we begin that work, it can address those things that we have some big light shined on, the racism, the sexism, the classism, all of those different things. It can shine a light, but it is so much better to deal with the root cause of a matter than just to peel away at the symptoms, if you will, right?
I completely agree. We must deal with the symptoms because often those are in the structures in our organisations, whether that's in our governments, in our organisations, in our businesses, we must deal with those things. But we also we are fooling ourselves if we think doing that will be enough, because we must look at the root cause. And yes, it's a big task. And for me, I look at this and go, this is a lifetime task now. Now that I'm aware of the fact that I have bias, because I haven't always been aware of this. Is not, not like I'm some sort of amazingly wonderful human being. I'm just an ordinary person who's discovered this for herself, and I want to share it with others. Because the thing that I was working with some refugees with the Salvation Army back in 2012 and 2013.
That would have been the Syrian refugees that were?
Well, they were from Sri Lanka, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran and Iraq. And all of these, and they were largely men at that stage, all of these men, here am I, the white-skinned Australian who only spoke English, and here were these men from all different colours of brown and black and speaking all these different languages. I'd grown up in the Christian faith tradition, and I knew most of them came from Muslim countries, so hugely challenged by the differences that I saw, and became aware of some fear in myself. And after a period of reflection, realised that, this whole thing about difference is a threat was an indicator that I had a latent racism. Now, that was shocking for me, because I would have said I didn't have a racist bone in my body. But I just learnt this, unintentionally, but it was still there. And so my values were that I valued all people. But my biases were saying, well, actually, you don't. You value white people and you don't value black and brown people as much, and you're afraid of them. And this is part of how I think as a human being. That has not gone away. But now I know about it. Because, see, I don't believe we can actually do away with or eliminate our biases, because they're an entrenched part of our thinking patterns. However, when we're aware of them, we can make intentional choices about how we use those biases. And that's where I, went from seeing difference as a threat to seeing it as an asset. And I still, to this day, and this will be ongoing for the rest of my life, I have to pull myself up when my brain goes to a particular thought pattern. And I'll give you an example. I've done a couple of podcasts. I've been doing a little bit of work with a wonderful woman from Ghana. Nigeria. I've got a couple of friends in Africa. And when I first met Abiola, I became aware, Abiola has 2 master's degrees.
She is highly educated woman. My automatic assumptions were, and I don't know why, but I was surprised when I found that out. Like, how arrogant is that? But there was this, look, it's really not nice that you find out about yourself. But so even as a person who's aware of how my racist bias operates, it still operates, and those automatic thoughts come into your mind. So it's about being kind to yourself, because what I have to do then in that space is go recognise that that's where my brain goes. Oh, I get surprised that a person who looks different to me, who's grown up in Africa of all places, could be anywhere near as educated as me, a white Australian. But that's the reality. Those thoughts go through my head. But now that I know, I get the choice. Yes.
How do I treat this person? What comes out of my mouth? What do I do to myself to say, Bron, you need to adjust your thinking here. You need to view this person in a different light. Yes. And so it's an ongoing process. And look, I don't think that the things that I deal with are purely restricted to white people. I have Vietnamese friends who said, oh, the Vietnamese just think they're the best people in Asia. So, it's not just white against black. As you say, it can be within a racial group, as we did about Catholics and Protestants.
Yes.
But it's about becoming aware of the automatic assumptions that we make about people and challenging them for ourselves. But doing it kindly, because, we'll never change. None of us are going to change quickly. It's a process.
It's a process. Absolutely. It's a process. And the fact that you're able to recognize it Like, and I totally agree with you. I don't think that just because of the way the human makeup is, that we'll ever totally walk free from certain things. However, we can become very aware of it and recognize the red flags and begin to do differently, and do that within ourselves, within our thinking in that moment. Like, oh, there's that. I guess I still got some work to do in that area, because why did my brain go there automatically? And
that's right.
And begin to, to process that through and begin to have totally different conversations. And I think that one of the reasons, I think that really the work that you're doing, it is very necessary, because and with your privilege, you're able to get into spaces and have these conversations with people who think that, no, I'm not, and like you were saying, you did not believe that there was a racist bone in your body, but because of the unconscious biases that were like layered deep within each of us as individuals, then you realize, well, maybe, just maybe, there is no harmful intent upon your part. But when you figured it out, okay, now let me go out and educate someone else about it. And in that process, help myself, because it's not an attack. I think that is by and large a large problem as to why some people reject this type of training or this type of conversation, because they feel attacked in their way of life or their way of thinking, or like you mentioned that you realize you have white privilege. You can't change that, but neither is that an attack on you. It should not be an attack on you. You should not feel ashamed for that. But as what you're doing, okay, how can I now take this privilege that I realize that I have and have a positive impact, whether it's in my local community or in my global community? How can I use that? Acknowledge it. Now, how can I use it for good and not for evil?
Yeah, and that's so true.
Yeah. And that's the thing, even for myself as an African-American woman, how can I use my position for good and not for evil? And how can I use it to have the necessary conversations and to be a part of the solutions to exposing systems and ways of thinking, but at the same time, bringing in answers? It does us no good to point out problems if we don't have solutions.
Completely agree. And one of the points that I've got to at the moment in my own thinking and in my speaking is to focus on equilibrium rather than merely equity, because like equity is good. And we use that term a lot, whether it's gender equity or racial equity. However, I think sometimes people feel as though moving towards equity is a zero-sum game where somebody has to lose for somebody else to win. That if you're going to get equity, well, then I'm going to have to give up something. Whereas if we look at focusing, having our goal as equilibrium, it's about looking at what can each of you and I bring to a given situation where, I like the idea of resonance, where we resonate with each other. I have a very different background and life experience to you. That's just a given. There is nothing we can do to change that. And we have much to learn from each other and to teach one another. And rather than thinking I have to give up something to give you or vice versa, it's about looking at, well, how can we bring this together? That doesn't mean that we don't have to address the actual inequities in our world.
Right.
Where people in a wheelchair are finding it physically difficult to get into a building, or women, there's still a pay gap. We have to address these things. We have to, like here in Australia, we have a lot of we have a higher ratio of Indigenous deaths in custody than we do for white people. We have to address those inequities, but it's about then, it's in tandem with that, we address the inequities, the structures that perpetuate, but we also need to focus on developing this equilibrium where we can resonate together as human beings, bring all the richness that each of us has. You know things I don't. It's just that's the way life is, and I can learn from you.
And it's I like that point of view, and dealing with our biases is necessary, because in order to have those type of conversations in that way, we have to deal with the underlying biases that cause us to not see one another as humans that deserve to have that conversation.
Yes.
So
that is excellent. You have hit the nail on the head.
Yes, it doesn't matter our socioeconomic background, our faith system, our economic status. None of that matters. We're humans. And as a human, I deserve to be able to have a conversation about my humanity, as well as you having that conversation about your humanity and how us living in this world, how we're impacting one another in a positive or negative light. But if you don't see me as human as you, then you won't invite me to that table to have that discussion, or you'll invite me to the table because the law has legislated that you do, but you're still not having the complete conversation with me. You're having just a little bit with me and having a larger conversation with other people who you feel are worthy of that conversation. A bias is when we're dealing with the ism, the racism, the classism, the sexism, all of that, we could create laws to make all of that wrong and illegal. Yes. But if we don't deal with the biases, which become a matter of the heart, if my heart posture doesn't change or my way of thinking about it does not change, then will that law actually work the way that it was intended? Because the people who have to execute the law have a flawed way of thinking.
Very much so. I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that some people find compliance very difficult.
Yes.
Like here in Melbourne, we had lots of lockdowns, but we also had lots of people out on the street protesting about that, yes, regardless of the fact that, there was a virus rampaging through the community. I think you're so right. It's like two things in tandem. We must make the structural changes, the legal changes that are important, that are essential to bring the equity that is needed. It's not that equity is not needed. We do need to put those laws in place. At the same time, you're so right. We have to be addressing the biases that have led to that inequity, that have led to those laws and structures being put in place. Because unless we do, as you say, some people will be compliant to a law, but if their heart hasn't changed, if their thinking hasn't changed, they will find ways to circumvent the law. We humans are very good at that, pushing the boundaries, finding the loopholes. But it will also, because you can't legislate, in a sense, around words, the quiet word that is whispered in someone's ear in the tea room or leant over the back of the chair. We can't legislate for the exclusion, the people who don't get on the email list, the people who don't get invited to after-work drinks. We can't legislate for those things. And it's in those areas where bias has been, not addressed, continues to have, dramatic and often very personal and devastating consequences.
Absolutely. In that conversation today, one of the gentlemen, the Hawaiian gentleman, asked the question. He said, what is the difference between the unarmed, during the chaos and the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, there were both peaceful protests and not peaceful protests that took place. But by and large, there were loads of peaceful protests that took place. And where people of all races, not just Black people, white people, Hispanic people, Asian people, were being brutalized by the police because of the protests that they were having. So he said, what is the difference between the police harming unarmed individuals in these protests and the police responding to what happened in our Capitol riots on January 6th? And that brought in a good conversation for bias. And one of the individuals said, well, the people at the Capitol were unarmed. But were they? Completely unarmed. So you're saying people were there without weapons or anything, but it's our constitutional right to bear arms. And if you have the proper permits, you can legally carry them. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see how your biases, and well, that particular gentleman was saying your racism, can you see how your racism is carrying your answer? Because the vast majority of people who stormed the Capitol were Caucasian versus the vast majority of the people who initially started with these protests were African American. But the longer they went on, allies outside of our community began to have a voice, and they were suffering the same things that African Americans were suffering at the hands of the police. So what is the difference? When you have, the answer that this gentleman he was trying to show this group how that their thinking was racist in nature, and they didn't realize it, even though they were Christian. But above and beyond that, their biases were in place, and not just because of the color of the skin. And I say that because, again, the protesters were not all Black, but the bias here is anything that was not of my faith system, was not of my way of thinking, that not follow the letter of the law the way that I thought it should be done. It's different from me, so you're wrong, right? Yes. And the people who were storming the Capitol because they were exercising their constitutional rights, then they should not, the person who was killed by the cop who had, infiltrated the Capitol, because that's treasonous, she shouldn't have been killed because she was unarmed. But what about the unarmed people who were killed or hurt? And especially, he used an example in New York, there was some protests, and there was an elderly gentleman. I want to say this gentleman was like in his 80s, and he was walking as a part of this protest, and the police beat him up on camera, and then they charged him. How is he different than the person that was shot, that committed a treasonous act, versus this guy walking as fast as he could to get away from the police, couldn't get away fast enough because, well, you're elderly, and he was harmed, brutally harmed. That's a bunch of unconscious bias. I'm not saying the individual that answered the question wasn't racist, but they were definitely biased in a lot of areas with their refusal to be able to see the whole picture here.
I completely agree with you there, particularly I think of the four main areas, I think, in which people suffer is with racism, sexism, ageism, and ableism. So disability, gender, age, and race. And on the whole, people don't like to think that they are racist, sexist, that they've got any issues with age, or that they discriminate against those who have disability. However, the conversation that you have just outlined shows how deeply seated our biases are and how very much part of our thinking they are. Because if someone can say it's okay to beat up and charge a Black person walking in this protest.
This gentleman was actually an elderly Caucasian person, like the older guy.
Oh, was he? Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry, I was assuming he was. Now, isn't that interesting? See, that was my assumption.
And that's why I'm not, I don't know whether this person is racist or not, but their biases in so many other areas had to be leading the thinking, because the examples were two white people, a white woman and a white man.
Yeah, so you can't, good, I'm glad you highlighted that, because I made an assumption about, it's really interesting, isn't it, how our minds work. So again, there was an assumption from the person you're talking about the activity that this person was protesting about Black lives. Yes. This activity here was somehow, sitting here in Australia looking at the footage, because we're watching it in real time, I couldn't believe it. It was like, this is like something out of a movie. This is the central heart of America, and here were white Americans storming the Capitol. It was quite shocking from our perspective, but you can say that's okay. Again, that it's unconscious thinking, unconscious attitudes about what constitutes right and wrong, what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable behaviours. And as you say, you can't tell whether this person that in their conversation was racist, but that the biases around activities, around what people do, around what people should or should not be doing, they will be based in some very long and deeply held assumptions about what's the right thing to be doing. And from your perspective, what's the American thing to be doing? What makes you a good American? That is a whole other story.
Yes. And that's it. The conversation there was, they felt like it was their right as an American. They were, challenging the validity of not only just our election, but exercising their right to protest. But they broke the law. Yeah. Like, they broke a lot of major laws. Hence, we're having the trials right now for these individuals because you just can't do that. And, I don't care how you feel about it. You cannot do that. But at the same time, the protesters who were protesting police brutality and systemic racism that flows through the current of our country, they also likewise have that right to protest. And they have that right. And we, as Americans, no matter the color of your skin, we have a right to protest. And we also have a right, according to the laws of the states that we live in, to openly carry a weapon while we're protesting. You just do. But the way that we think and feel about one group doing it over another group, where one group is okay to do it and another group is not okay to do it, there's a lot of things we need to unpack about. Because no matter what happens with our upcoming trial, no matter how many people may or may not go to jail, you can't legislate a heart issue. You can't legislate and cause people to address their unconscious biases that may have led them to do some very stupid things. And
agreed.
Have a lot of people that support them in these activities, no matter what they are. But if we can look at it as something, really small. Again, the issue with you getting your ears pierced. Our unconscious biases have such an amazing impact on our life. My husband says all the time to our kids, your perception is your reality. Well, our unconscious biases develop our perception.
They do. And see, as you were speaking, I'm thinking, okay, the person that you had this conversation with, what I'm seeing is that unconsciously, and they may never admit this, they were thinking that the people who stormed the Capitol actually had a validity to their claim, whereas the people who are protesting about Black Lives Matter do not have a valid claim. So there's, to me, the things that are coming through was that this person, whether they would admit it or not, felt that, Trump's assertion that the result was wrong and that the election was stolen, that in a sense they were unconsciously saying, yeah, I believe that too, because I agree, these people shouldn't have been hurt, whatever. Whereas they were also unconsciously communicating that actually Black lives don't matter, because it's quite okay to beat up and charge someone who was protesting about the validity of Black lives. So we communicate, even without saying those words straight out. We communicate what is actually in our hearts. The Bible does say, out of the heart, the mouth speaks. Yes. Not always in plain language, but in just even the little things that we say are right and wrong, are acceptable or unacceptable. We are communicating so much more, perhaps, that we realise.
And absolutely, that is very well said, and that absolutely true. These types of conversations should be had, just in my opinion, much more often and in all different spaces, because we should be challenged in our way of thinking, and we should be challenged in not right, not wrong, but challenged to the root cause of why we believe what we believe, why are we thinking the way that we're thinking, and how it affects our behavior and our response to humanity in general,
Yes.
And it's not an academic or political issue. It's a human issue.
Yes, it is a human issue. Yeah, and, obviously your listeners won't be able to see what the virtual background I've got up here, but, I've got there, curating courageous conversations to navigate changes in culture, because that's what I'm about, is having these sorts of conversations. They are courageous, but we have to have them if we're going to bring about the changes to our cultures that are needed so that we have equilibrium between people.
You are very correct. And I'm going to read that again. So, guys, I hope you wrote that down, because that's a good quote. Curating courageous conversations to navigate changes in culture. Absolutely. Absolutely. Could not agree with you more. Wow, Bron, our time has passed by so fast. We could have probably about 10 more conversations off of some of the things that we just, kind of skipped over the surface of in this conversation alone, because it really challenges us in the way that we think, and our unconscious biases. They have no skin tone preference. They have no skin tone preference. They have no sexual orientation preference. We can look at different communities and see how within each of these communities, that just within our own community, we have biases against one another.
Yes.
Within certain communities, like within socioeconomic status, individuals who have inherited money, how do they feel about individuals who earn their money, or individuals who are Protestant, and individuals who are Catholic, individuals who are Episcopalian, or Methodist, like men and women, or women who are of a certain pedigree. I'm a housewife, and you got to go to work, or, oh, you're just a housewife and I earn 6 or 7 figures. Like, so many different things.
Yes.
That's a human issue.
It is a human issue. Absolutely. Yep. We're all in this together.
We are all in this together. And if we continue to work together, curate these courageous conversations that will help to navigate changes in culture, we can grow together, we can heal together, we can learn from one another, and we can be stretched and challenged to create the change that needs to be done. So again, Bron, thank you so much for being such an amazing guest here on Laquita's Toolbox. This has been a great conversation. I do thank you so much again for coming. But before we go, is there one last thing that you would like to leave with the Toolbox audience? And your contact information. Yes. Let me not forget that part. Your contact information. Yes.
Let's do that first. You can, my website is bronwilliams.com, so nice and simple. You can email me at info@bronwilliams.com. You can stalk me on LinkedIn. I'm there very, very often, have a good presence. So they're the 3 main ways that you can connect with me. And I think the thing that I would leave people with is to, again, come back to the fact that this is not about judgment and shame and guilt. So be kind to yourself and be kind to others as you do this journey. Once you start on the journey of looking at your unconscious biases, you will not stop. It's not like, oh, I ticked the box, I've done that, my unconscious biases are fine. This is an ongoing journey, and you will revert to type. You will fall back into your default ways of thinking. So will other people. So be kind, but allow yourselves to have conversation, first of all, with yourself that you need, and then to have courageous conversations with others.
Awesome. Thank you. That is some amazing words of wisdom there. Listen, guys, thank you so much for tuning in for this amazing episode of Laquita's Toolbox Live. Again, hit those like, share, and follow buttons. And most of all, I want to hear from you in the comments. You leave me a rating or a review on your favorite podcast listening platform. Let me know what you think about the tools that we're providing here at Laquita's Toolbox. If you think I'm a rock star, definitely want to hear that. If you say, Laquita, you're kind of failing there and you're not having the relevant conversations, I want to hear that even more, because I want to make sure that we're bringing you the conversations that you want to hear about. So if you got some thoughts and some ideas on some topics that I have not yet discussed, but I need to discuss, send those to me. You can email me at podcast@laquitamonley.com, or even more preferred, get in the comment section of your favorite podcast listening platform and leave me a comment and letting me know what you think and how you feel. Look forward to hearing from you. But until next time, this is Laquita Monley. This has been Laquita's Toolbox, and you guys have a great day.